Right, okay, so good afternoon everybody and welcome to today's webinar. We're very pleased to welcome Andrew Drewary here, who's kindly agreed to deliver this session. We also have Tony Boff, who is the chair of the Financial Services Group. He'll be dealing with the Q&A a little bit later. I will shortly be handing you over to Andrew, but before I do so, I just wanted to mention a few things. So firstly, for those of you who haven't attended one of our IOSH webinars, I'm Ben Pollard and I take care of the technical aspects of these sessions. So if there are any problems, just email me and I shall try to assist as best as I can. So on your screen then, most likely located at the top left-hand side, you'll notice a small bar with some written options on them. These are chat and Q&A. If you have any technical issues or audio problems and you need to message me at any point, just use the chat option. If you have any specific questions for Andrew relating to the content of the session, please use the Q&A option and ask your questions here. Tony will then run through all of these with Andrew at intervals during the session and also at the end of the session. And we'll aim to tackle as many of these as possible. If for any reason we run out of time and there are still questions remaining, we will look at these after the webinar and aim to post some written answers online with a recording of this webinar. So with all that said, I shall now hand you over to Andrew, and I hope that you all enjoy the session.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This afternoon session should take you through a few bits and pieces in respect of driver safety for all your fleet drivers that you have on the road, to deal with some basic health and safety issues and some legal issues as well. So it's a bit of an interactive session and there'll be some short poll questions at the beginning of each section, and there'll also be some video footage as well to break up the session as well, to hopefully hammer home what we're trying to get across today, and also to raise some questions that you want to put forward to ourselves later on. Just a bit of background about myself. I'm currently employed as Road Risk Manager at Crawford & Company, and prior to that I've been 18 years investigating road traffic collisions, of which I've dealt with over 37,000 incidents over the years. And on the screen you can see some of the associations that I'm currently working with to improve road safety. And prior to that I was 14 years as a benefits investigator in Liverpool, so I've got plenty of experience as an investigator. But in respect of some background of the collisions I've been dealing with over the years, of the 37,000, unfortunately probably 1.5% of those collisions have resulted in fatalities. So over the years that works out, I deal with about 25 fatalities a year. So given that fleet work is the majority of my work, 80% of my work, it just shows how dangerous driving for work is as an occupation, and whether it is classed as your actual occupation or part of your job description or not. Just a brief summary of why we're here today is to look at your responsibility as fleet operators and managers in respect of your employees out and about on the road. Don't know before whether you caught the summary that I provided regarding the number of collisions I've been involved with over the years, with probably about 1.5% of those being fatalities. I think if we move on now with the delay, just for some industry background, this is some of the awards that I've won over the last couple of years in relation to the work and the issues that we're going to discuss this afternoon. So I'll start with a video to set the scene for you all. There is no sound with this video, just so in case anybody's concerned. And as you can see, drivers had a tyre blowout. Now, I don't know if anybody's seen this video before, but when you watch it again, just as the guy takes a step forward here, literally saves his life. So only when you see it in slow motion again, he does only move a few inches, but how far over the other vehicle is into the hard shoulder. So I've chosen this video to set the scene today to give you an idea of some of the issues that are out and about on the road for your employees and your drivers. And that stat there is quite startling. Over 800 people a year killed or injured on the hard shoulder or in lay-bys. There was some information came out from the Recovery Agents Institute just before Christmas last year, explaining that they have a casualty, either injured or a fatality, with one of their members every 6 days while they're attending a breakdown on our roads. So it just goes to show it's not all about your own safety that we're going to talk about today. It's also about the safety of others while they're out and about on the road. So, things we need to consider. Managing your drivers and your own fleet of vehicles. So let's look at the following. How well do you know your drivers? That's paramount when you start at the start of this process. If you're taking on a new employee, you don't know them very well. So there are background checks and things you need to consider moving forward. What are the moral obligations involved with running a safe fleet? Well, the main one is improved road safety for all, as well as employee safety. Economic reasons. We know with the issue of corporate manslaughter these days and the potential fines that go along with any breaches and convictions, but prevention is always better than cure. So don't think road safety is a costly exercise. If implemented properly, it will save you money in the long term and also more or less pay for itself. Legal obligations. The potential of criminal charges. We need to have a safe working environment and make sure it's not just your own employees that you have to consider when your team are out on the road. And a duty of care towards providing a safe working environment is paramount. We know that driving is the most dangerous work activity, but very few people, unless you're classed as a driver, have driving as a job description or an item on their job description. So in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been pretty stagnant, the number of deaths on the road whilst at work, which is around about 600. So compared to the Health and Safety Executive that deal with 144 deaths per year at work, driving is still the most dangerous work activity, and special issues need to be considered as we go through. This presentation will help you deal with those. And we have to fulfill regulatory obligations. For public inquiry, if you run a fleet of commercial vehicles, fours and clocks are the same, but just general health and safety issues need to be considered. So things we're going to look at today, 5 sections, all look very straightforward. And we're going to have a little poll for the start of each section before we go into a little video clip. So I think if we can start the poll at this stage for speed and hazard perception, there'll be 3 questions come up on your screen. And if you can take the next, 20 seconds, should we say, to complete. And then we'll look at the results as we go through the process, through this section. So speed and hazard perception is the first one. At the start of each section, there'll be a video just to set the scene of what we're gonna deal with. As you can see here, no sound at all on this video, so don't be alarmed if you can't hear anything at the minute. This video was captured from an in-cab camera in one of the HCVs following that vehicle just outside Peterborough, if anybody knows the location. As you can see, the vehicle's totally cleared the roundabout before impacting on the road surface. And you can see how it's ended up. So just as to summarise for you, the lady driving the vehicle walked away with hardly any injuries, but she was 3.5 times over the limit for drink driving at the time. And as you can see at the time at the top of the video, that is just before 11:45 in the morning. Also, she had a 2-month-old baby in the back seat as well, in a child seat. Fortunately, the child also came out of this incident pretty much unscathed. So for the makers of that vehicle and that child seat, then it shows how good safety precautions are from a technology perspective, but it just shows you cannot legislate for people and the way that they drive. So, speeding and hazard perception, the need not to speed. In relation to the questions we've had, as we touch on the first poll question, when was the last time you read the highway code? So, we've got 29% have said never since passing the driving test, 27% said once in the last 10 years, 21 in the last 3 years, and 23% in the last 12 months. I would say those results are pretty standard from having done this presentation a number of times over the last 6 months. I don't think it is an issue that people go back to very often once they pass the test, unless it is for a professional reason. So the highway code is there for everybody to use. And again, for how often do you get your drivers your own employees to read the highway code? 64% of you have said you've never asked any of your employees to read the highway code. So given the fact that you're asking people to go out on the road, to not get them to read the highway code before you ask them to undertake some of their employment duties, I think is quite a startling figure, really. So, and if we look at the last question, or the next question, how many vehicles are on the road in the UK? Right, we've got, yes, 44% of you said over 35 million, which is great. 37 million was the last count from DVLA. So, highway code, vitally important piece of legislation and reference to use for your employees. But the split of vehicles on the road is quite startling as well. I think a lot of you may think there's a lot more HGVs on the road than the actual 1.3%. But yeah, there are just over 400,000 HGVs and commercial vehicles on the road at this moment in time. Vans, yeah, 4 million vans on the road. So again, it is an issue we need to consider as from a health and safety perspective. White van man has a reputation for the way that they drive, but actually they're not, probably statistics show that they're not the worst drivers on the road at this moment in time. So as we said, our vehicle driver reputation is justified. We just touched on that. I think the number of vehicles, I think car drivers roughly should have the worst vehicle reputation out there, because there's more car drivers alone on the road than any other vehicle or all the vehicles put together. Society, customers are driving the need for speed. With all the vehicles that are out there and the increase in home delivery, the likes of Amazon and people like that, you've got people wanting things delivered to them almost yesterday. I'll touch on an example from Amazon just before Christmas last year. Christmas Eve last year, watching the television, 6 o'clock in the evening, there was an Amazon advert on the television explaining that if you ordered by 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve, they'd guarantee delivery by midnight that evening. So you've got to think about, we want these things, we want it now is the issue that is coming across in today's society. Very few of us are prepared to wait, but I think it's something we have to consider. What we're asking people who drive for a living, what we're asking them to do on a day-to-day basis, and what sort of risks we're asking them to undertake throughout their activities. So, do you have and implement a speeding policy? Two very different things in that question. One is having the policy, two is implementing the policy. So most people will have a policy. The issue here is how well is it implemented. Failure to implement the policy will leave you open to the issues, regulatory issues further down the line and legal issues further down the line. So it's good practice to get into the habit of having the policy is one thing, but implementing the policy as well. As well as implementing the policy, you also need to understand whether your drivers know what that policy is. Is it just a given that they drive, you think they drive within the legal legislation while they're out on the road behind the wheel? Or do you have specific training courses, rules and regulations that they have to stick to in relation to their duties while they're working with you. So one, having the policy is paramount. Two, implementing the policy and making sure all your drivers are aware of it is more important. And you'll probably see as we go through the slides, these two questions start to become a little bit repetitive, but there's a reason for that. So what are the consequences, personal and current penalties? So I think the issue is there's numerous issues for speeding. There's different grades of penalties that are out there, and the same for corporate. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the worst penalties you have to consider if you don't manage your fleet of vehicles and drivers on the road is that driver is imprisonment for the driver, and it's also imprisonment for you as an employer or any of the company directors. There are handouts we've got prepared for the end of the presentation. So if anybody wants a copy of the handouts, then by all means, we'll provide an email address at a later date for you to email in, and we'll get a PDF version of all the handouts out to you. So that's the end of speeding and hazard perception. Do we want to take a question at this minute?
Yeah, certainly. So we've got a question in. What is a speeding policy over and above the legal standards?
Speeding policy over and above the legal standards, that comes down to individual discretion for you as your company. The highway code is out there. Make sure you get people to read the highway code to keep you up to date with current legislation. But what a company does over and above the highway code is entirely up to them. But the highway code is the minimum they need to work to.
Should we then be getting the highway code and issuing it and getting people to sign for it when we've done that?
I would suggest it's good practice. The rules and regulations change. The issues over death by dangerous driving under the influence of alcohol is potentially likely to change this year to be classed as to be life imprisonment. So you need to be aware of the changes of the legislation that are coming through. Well, I personally, having run a fleet of vehicles myself, my guys, I insisted my team of drivers read the highway code on a 12-month basis, and it was put on their file at work, their personnel file at work, to make sure they'd gone through the training. Okay, super. So next section. We've got 3 questions coming up on alcohol.
Malcolm has recently been promoted to CEO of photocopying.
Guys, have you seen how well he's doing?
Yesterday, he was on a night out with his regional manager, Derek. They were bonding. Suddenly, Derek handed Malcolm a drink. A big shot from a big gun. But Malcolm had already had one. I'm driving, he said. And a second drink won't matter. No, sorry, said Malcolm. No, I'm the one who's sorry, lad, said his regional manager. Malcolm's been sent to Siberia. Return date TBC. Photocopying. But alive.
Very subtle video, but quite a story, a telling headline to finish with. I think if we do the next 3 questions on the poll before we start this section, we give you 15-20 seconds to answer these questions. So, which month of the year are you most likely to be caught drink driving? How often do you test your drivers for alcohol and drug use? And have you asked your drivers if they have an alcohol drug problem? Some interesting results coming through. I think we'll touch on the answers a little bit later in this section while a few more people still come through. So, right, which month of the year are we most likely to be caught drink driving? From the poll, we have 72% say December, 18% say August, 4% May, 7% January. I would suggest from the figures that are there, that is pretty common feedback from around the seminars I've done recently. So December, actually, although December's 72%, May, according to Merseyside Police, where I come from, if you hadn't guessed from my accent, May is the most common month for drink driving in the Merseyside northwest area. Reason for this is that you tend to have, well, we have 3 bank holidays very close together. You've got Easter, which we just had, but very early this year, and then we have the 2 May bank holidays close together. So for those people working in a commercial environment, if they're working 4 days on, 4 days off, and they get 4 days of nice weather, they tend to spend a bit more time with the family and friends as the summer season starts, providing the weather is nice. So it's something to bear in mind when you're dealing with alcohol as part of your policy at work. Probably worthwhile reiterating what the policy is when the hour goes on in the summer and when the hour goes off in the winter, just to reinforce what message you need to get across to your employees. So the morning after, yes, we need a policy for morning after. Lots of people, particularly in the industry that I work in, the insurance industry, there are lots of corporate events, entertaining, things like that. We have to consider what we do. So the morning after in certain industries, yes, there's nights out and you have to think about what you're going to do the following day. Do you have a testing policy for your drivers the next day? Are you able to self-test them? So things like that. So on one of the questions that we've just asked, how often do you test your drivers? Have we got the results for that? So 57% of you have said never, 6% once every year, 25% randomly, 10% a year, only if they're involved in a collision, 13%. Yeah, I would say that's pretty standard. None, unfortunately, is the primary answer in this instance. So it's something, I think, going forward, it's something to review with your policy going forward. Particularly if you've got corporate events at work, think about how you're going to get to work the following day, and what issues and what your issues you're opening up for yourself as a company and also your employees if you're taking them out on a corporate event. So what are the current limits? Limits are different between Scotland and the rest of the UK, likely to change in Northern Ireland shortly as well. But again, regardless of the limits, they are fixed limits. And again, this will be detailed in the handouts that will be made available to you. I think it's very important for you and your employees not to be waylaid and get into the habit of thinking that, yes, you can have 1 drink, you can have 2 drinks, whatever. I think you need to make a conscious effort for a company policy that you're happy with. My best advice would be don't drink if you're on company business, and also if you're going to drive, don't have 1 at all, because doing what I've done for over the years and investigated over 37,000 collisions, I've seen the consequences of what happens if people drink and drive. So again, the limits will be in the handouts that are given to you at the end of the presentation. So, do you know if your drivers have an alcohol problem? So let's go to the poll results for the 3rd question in this matter. Have any of your drivers had alcohol problem? Yes, 28, no, 72. 72%, I would say, is probably, it doesn't surprise me for people not asking the drivers. It's a subject, again, as with drugs, it's a subject that people don't really want to touch on. But from a corporate perspective, you need to know whether your drivers, your employees who are out on the road driving have an issue, because ultimately at the end of the day, the issue could come back to you from a corporate responsibility. So this guy on the screen now, he was the driver of this vehicle last year on the M1. So 8 deaths, 4 seriously injured, death by dangerous driving and seriously injured by dangerous driving. When this incident happened in the middle of the morning, around about 3 o'clock, he was twice the legal limit, and he'd also had his driving licence revoked 37 days earlier. So this raises a number of questions for you, for those of you in HR and your drivers that are out there. What policies do you have in place to understand for checking driving licenses, for being notified if they've been revoked by DVLA, and for alcohol testing and random testing for your drivers before you let them out on the road? This is a worst case scenario, and although this guy was the first vehicle in the sandwich of the two vehicles on the M1 at the time, he'd actually been stationary for about 8 minutes on the motorway, just past his junction in lane 1. So it wasn't just a random collision that had happened on the spur of the moment. There was a lead up to this incident. So do you have, here come the questions again, do you have and implement an alcohol and testing policy? Have a policy is one thing, implementing it is another. And I think it's vitally important in this day and age that you need to implement a robust testing policy. And also communicate it to your drivers. Do your drivers know about it and what it is? And make sure the safeguarding processes in place that if drivers or employees regularly find a way of missing their test when they're asked to produce one, then you have processes in place to deal with that from a disciplinary perspective. So again, what are the consequences? Again, there'll be handouts for dealing with all of the legal issues and the penalties, but from a personal perspective, you've got death by dangerous driving, and corporate perspective is corporate manslaughter. So that's the end of the second session on alcohol. Any questions?
Yeah, certainly we've had quite a few. Firstly, is there any legislation in place for testing?
Testing at the minute is down to the individual companies. They have to have it built into their policy to make sure it fits in with current legislation that's out on the road. And I think that's why a number of companies still don't have a random testing policy in place. They're happy to accept that their employers will work within the law, but as an employer, you need to ensure that you're upholding the law and you understand how these things affect your employees.
And also, in terms of GDPR, is there an impact in relation to that for asking for that information?
It's a difficult one. It's down to GDPR. I would say you're looking more at driver welfare in this issue. So if you've got a potential or a suspicion that a driver may have an issue, then you, as a duty of care as an employer, you need to tackle that and challenge the employee concerned. Or if an employee comes to you and say they've got an issue, then you need to deal with it. Okay.
Also, questions in terms of trade union and their involvement, and whether in your experience they're receptive, and how you go about talking to them about potentially implementing these.
I think it's vitally important to work with the trade unions, because they will give certain advice and direction from their members. But I think instead of it being an issue over you must do this or you must do that, it's work within a policy of driver welfare, health and well-being, and tackle it as a health and well-being scenario and not a disciplinary scenario. That'd be the main advice. So you're working with somebody that may have a problem to help them out of the problem instead of disciplining them. Okay. So, next section, drugs. Very short, succinct video, but it's something that is becoming more common this day and age, and is an area of society that we need to be more aware of within the driving industry. So, fully aware or impaired, that's what we're looking at here. So we've got another 3 questions for you to look at. We can bring these up on the poll. Very straightforward questions. How many drugs are illegal to take while driving? So we've got 8, 11, 14 or 17. Do you implement a pre-employment drug alcohol testing policy? and how often do you reaffirm your testing policies? Never, once a year, twice a year, or only when there's been a collision. So, how many drugs are illegal for drink driving? We'll take that one first. 22 say 8, 22% say 8, 13% say 11, 20% say 14, and 45% say 17. Yeah, there are the bit of a catchy question, that one really. There are 8 illegal drugs, but there are also 9 prescribed drugs, so the total is 17, and it is something that we'll touch on a little bit more as we go through this this section. So, and do you implement a drug alcohol testing policy? That's quite interesting. 75%, 3/4 of you say no. When we go through this section, hopefully some of you may change your thoughts on that issue as we go through. So let's look at what we've got here. So we've got how many drugs are legal to take while driving. We've done that on the poll. Are prescribed drugs illegal to take? Yes, we've touched that as well on the poll. There's 8 illegal drugs, 9 prescribed drugs. And the prescribed drugs are a major issue in this day and age as we have an aging population. And particularly, say, in the commercial vehicle industry where the average age of drivers is 55 years of age. So the older you get, once you hit 50, more likely you are to need medical attention and to have some medication from your GP. So what must you remember if you're taking prescribed drugs when you're driving? It is a copy of the prescription. And you must have a copy of the prescription with you at all times. Say must, probably, I would say must, it is a must in this instance. If you get stopped and you are driving without a copy of your prescription, there is a likelihood that you will still be done for driving whilst under the influence of drugs, even if you're not necessarily impaired. So it is something to consider moving forward if you are on these types of drugs. And the limits for the 17 drugs vary considerably. So again, you need to read the individual sheets that come through with the medication, and you need to look at the guidance that says that is provided with the leaflets that come in the boxes. Bear in mind, I'll speak again. I come from Merseyside. I use Merseyside as an example quite a lot, but Merseyside Police will stop people for driving probably more whilst distracted than driving under the influence of drugs. It's the distraction of your driving that brings it to the attention of Merseyside Police. So knowing your limits, my advice is, yes, if you're driving, make sure you know what the limits are and what the potential issues are, and stick to what the guidance is. So you need to have a drug policy in place. And you need to know if any of your drivers have a drug problem. Finding out after the event can be catastrophic for yourselves as a company, but you need to understand those people that you're putting out on the road in the name of the company, that they are fit to drive when they go out and about on the road day in, day out. So do you have an implemented drugs policy? Again, most people will have a policy. The issue here is to make sure that you implement the policy. And are your drivers aware of it? So make sure that you undertake the training courses with the drivers to make them aware of what they need to tell you and what things they need to have in place, and you need to have in place in case there are any issues that are there. So again, personal consequences and current penalties, personal and corporate. Worst case scenario, it'll always be death by dangerous driving as an individual and potentially corporate manslaughter. But again, there is a handout for this section detailing all the current penalties and regulations and guidance for you at the end of the session. Okay. That's finished with drugs, yeah? Any questions?
We've got one in general with both drugs and alcohol. Can people, or where do people stand using a testing kit that they would purchase over that's police approved, over and above using somebody independent? What should we do and what can we do?
I think if you're implementing a policy within the workplace, issuing with drivers with single-use testers is a great way to start. so they can carry them at all times. So if you've got employees staying out overnight, staying in hotels, and you allow them to have a drink in the evening, perhaps build it into the policy that they use a single-use test, and if there's an issue, then you have to have the policies in place and processes in place so they know what to do at the end if they can't drive, or if it's in that area, the red area sort of thing. So in that issue, but in respect of the other sort of drug testing equipment that's out there, if your test didn't work and it's a negative and it's a positive test, it still has to be sent away to be retested as well by a medical expert. Okay, so you have to take have a process in place that if they fail the test initially, you have to take them off the road, and then you have to review the process, the outcome once you've had the formal findings back, once it's been tested in the lab. Okay.
Also, if you have a suspicion of someone being unfit and they refuse to take the test, what can you do?
Comes down to what you have in your contract of employment and what guidance you've given your employees at that time. Personally speaking, that would be a disciplinary issue, but it would have to be in your disciplinary processes internally. You can't just randomly bring it in and say, but you can make that choice not to give them any work on the day. If you suspect that they may be impaired, don't send them out. It cuts the confrontation. You can deal with it, but the duty of care as an employer, you've got to make sure everybody on the road is safe, whether that's pedestrians or other car users.
Also, under legislation, do you have to have a drug testing policy?
That's interesting. It's still not legal. I think you need to make sure you're happy with your own processes and policies in place that you're implementing at this moment in time. If you feel, because of what's been raised today, that you need to change that, then that's great. But I think you need to be led by your own processes and policies and your own legal department internally, what you want to do. But best practices, I would have one in place, and it's a strict and robustly enforced one.
And very quickly, what's the company responsibility if you have a policy and you've done everything you can do for both drug and alcohol and the driver doesn't tell us?
You have, as long as you can prove you've done everything possible, then, and you can document it, and you've got the physical proof if something happens at a later date, then more often than that, you will be fine. Okay. Next, mobile phones.
No, I'm going to get up work tomorrow.
And portable equipment.
So he goes, all right, I'll go up the pole. So he's got, I'll go up the pole, how much? Right, and Leo's on 100 quid. 100 quid to go up.
Come on.
Touch my hair.
Seatbelt.
Yes. So Leo, he's only got his pants and his bow tie on it, and he just starts climbing it, and the lights go on, and everyone's looking, and do you think I should drive?
Yeah, what was I thinking? Just got to get this text off.
My turn to drive. Good driver.
That could be a familiar scene for a lot of people on a Friday evening, but think of what the word at the end there, the little sentence coming up at the end. Although they say twice as likely for drink driving and using your mobile phone, I think there's recent research from Crawford University that suggests it's up to almost 5 times more likely to have an issue, a collision whilst using your mobile phone than just being over the drink drive limit. So wait to take that call. We've got a few questions here to start the session again. So we can take a bit of time to go through these questions. How often do you use your mobile phone, including hands-free, while driving? So we've got never, only if someone calls you, up to 5 times a day, over 5 times a day to make and receive calls. So question 2, who's pulled over and stopped with the engine running, including in stationary traffic, say at traffic lights, to talk, check, send a text or email? And who has called an employee or a colleague knowing they are driving? So let's look at some of the results as we are coming through. So who's used a mobile phone while driving, including hands-free? In some interesting results there. Only if somebody calls, 50%, 51%. That's probably the highest I've had out in this poll at this moment in time. Never, 33. That's probably the highest I've had in this poll as well. I think the question 2 is a bit more interesting. Including in stationary traffic to check and talk or send a text. 63% of you have said yes there. If you touch the unit, even if it's your hands-free touch screen, allegedly hands-free touch screen, it's not hands-free while you're touching the screen. So under legislation, and I think it was Nottinghamshire Police clarified this for a lot of people before Christmas last year, that even touching the screen is classed as using the mobile device whilst driving. So again, you need to think of what you write into your policies and what you expect your staff and yourselves to do out and about on the road. So have you ever called anybody knowing that they are driving? Again, 53%, almost 50-50 split on this one. 53% say yes. Again, think about what you're asking them to do. Do they have a fully hands-free kit, or what are your policies if you're calling somebody on the road? You need to think of a way of communicating with somebody. The mobile phone is a valuable tool for this day and age, but it brings its own problems with it. So again, we've gone through the hands-free, the first 2 or 3 questions on here in the poll. So this guy, Mr. Wagstaff, is the other driver on the M1 on the 26th of August last year, and he pleaded guilty to death by careless driving on 8 accounts, although he was on his hands-free for an hour prior to the collision. Talking about football, talking about things he just wanted to get off his chest, with a regular other driver on the road at that time of night who he'd become pally with, and it was a common issue. So think about hands-free. He'd been driving for an hour before the collision. So who's called a driver knowing they are driving? Again, just looked at the last photographs and think of the poll. Just by calling somebody you know who is driving, you are potentially putting them at risk while they're on the road, because you're distracting them from what they should be doing, is concentrating on the road by asking them to answer the phone. So what is your driver's current interpretation of the current legislation? Most vehicles are fitted with a technically hands-free kit, because you can flick a button on the steering wheel. I would suggest 90% of vehicles with that are really hands-free for taking an incoming call and not an outgoing call. So you have to think about what you're asking your staff to do and what you're doing yourself when you're using your phone on the road. So again, I would imagine most people will have a telephone policy for their members of staff on the road, but how is it implemented? So you can, I know on the iPhone now, you can download the app that cuts off the phone if you say you're driving, and it won't take any incoming calls. So think about what you want your staff to do. We know instant communication is vital this day and age, but you also have to think of the consequences. But do your drivers know what your policy is, and do you implement it and follow it through with them? So again, personal and current penalties, personal and corporate. Again, we always come back to the worst case scenarios. Death by dangerous driving and potential corporate manslaughter. Again, there'll be a handout with all the penalties detailed for you that you can have access to at the end of the session. Okay.
Yeah, so a quick question. Is using Siri or OK Google, for those that have Android phones, classed as hands-free to call out?
To call out, as long as you don't touch anything to call out. You don't touch the unit, you don't touch a keypad, whether it's a touch screen or whatever, because by touching the screen, you're taking your hand off the wheel. So you're technically touching, it's being classed as touching the mobile phone. Okay, super. Final section, medical conditions.
Tonight, John will die in his sleep. He's warm, comfortable, and has his family by his side. drive tired.
So, quite a sobering video. Yes, quite clear. No other vehicles on the road there, but those of you who do early morning starts or drive late after meetings and a full day in the office, you have to consider the issues that you're putting, the places and the consequences you're possibly opening yourselves up to. So, fit to drive to stay alive. Well, last 3 questions here, because this is the final section for you. So, 3 questions now for you to look at. How often do you or your drivers, or do you insist your drivers or employees have an eye test? Never, every 12 months, every 2 years, only when asked to do so. How many medical conditions can automatically stop you from driving? So we've got 5, 10, 15 or 20. And how many medical conditions are potentially reportable to DVLA? So we've got 10, 50, 100 or 75. So, start with the first one here. Question: have all your drivers had an eyesight test in the last 12 months? I think it's recommended by opticians that you have an eyesight test every 2 years. But personally, having run a fleet of vehicles myself, I insisted my drivers had an eyesight test every 12 months. I would give them 2 weeks grace past anniversary date, and if they went past that 2-week date, I would take them off the road. I had contingency plans to do it just in case, but once they missed one test, they wouldn't miss one again. So looking at the results, we've got 15% say never, 24% every 12 months, 43% every 2 years, which is standard for most people, and only asked when to do so, 18%. So yeah, although it's recommended to have an eyesight test every 2 years, I personally would recommend every 12 months because it also highlights other potential medical conditions, i.e. diabetes is obviously the main one that can be highlighted from an eyesight test. So, fatigue. Is fatigue a medical condition or not? Actually, fatigue is not a medical condition per se. It is a symptom of numerous medical conditions. So, think about, we've seen on the video, the effects of driving tired. Make sure you have policies and processes in place for monitoring your drivers. Those of you who aren't professional drivers, those of you who have private vehicle use drivers out there or grey fleet drivers, that you do have a process in place to give them adequate time to have a break during driving time during the day. So, how many medical conditions are reportable to DVLA? Going back to the poll, let's look at question 3 then. So 39% of you say 10, 39% you say 50, 13% say 100, and 9% of you say 175 or more. There are potentially 183 at the last count medical conditions that are potentially reportable to DVLA. Some of them are known under potentially the same condition under different names, but they can all potentially have an issue whilst driving. So those of you who have a fleet of commercial vehicle drivers, bus, coach, HGV drivers, there's 180 medical conditions that are potentially reportable to DVLA. Those of you who just have ordinary licenses, then it's around about 150 could affect your license entitlement. They do chop and change as different medication comes out and different treatment comes out, but I think it's something you need to be aware about when you're asking your drivers to go out on the road. So, do you have a driver or anybody that's reported a condition to DVLA? Well, going back to question 2, when we asked how many medical conditions can automatically stop you from driving, do we have the results there for question 2? So, 34% of you said 20 plus, 30% 15, 37% say 10, and none said 5. 21 there was at the last count. That can potentially take your license away automatically. Some there are various restrictions, and again in the handouts that you can request will detail which conditions are only temporary reporting, that could potentially take your license away for between 2 to 4, maybe 6 weeks at a time. But there are different conditions out there, and depending on the length of time you have a medical condition, depends on whether you need to report it or not. So again, understanding what the health considerations are of your drivers is vitally important. So on the screen now, we've got Harry Clark. We all know this guy from Glasgow bin lorry. So 6 killed, 15 seriously injured. So failed to declare medical conditions. So again, need to have policies in place, even for short-term medical conditions. Because on medication that people get from the GP, it may say you can drive, but not use machinery. A number of police forces throughout the UK now are using the vehicle as a piece of machinery. So you have to think about that as if you're letting your staff out on the road and other road users. Again, come to the repetitive stage of each section. Do you have and implement a policy for reported medical conditions? It's vitally important that you do. And you need to have some sort of guidance and processes in there for yourselves as employers to how you're going to deal with and support an employee that comes to you with a medical condition. So we have personal and corporate consequences. Again, we go back to death by dangerous driving, and we also have potential corporate manslaughter issues to consider. And finally, we come to the summary, but have you got any questions to ask on this one? Just one question.
Yes, certainly. So the first one I can see that is probably on everybody's mind is who would pay for the eye tests for drivers, and should this be covered by the company?
My company, yes, they pay for the eye test. That's something that needs to be dealt with within the policies, within the group. But if you're being asked to drive for work purposes, then I would recommend, or I would support, that the company pays for the eye test. Okay.
One more, and very much a general one in relation to your entire session. So we've got a driving policy which includes grey fleet, and the senior management have said that we've got a policy, people just need to read the policy, we don't need to do anything else. Do you have any suggestions about how maybe to get them to take that a bit more seriously?
That's probably the most commonly asked question when it comes to policies. Most companies do have policies, but they don't implement the policies. There's a very, very big difference. I think if it comes, hopefully the session today and some of the videos will educate people that it's all right having the policy, but you need to implement it and you need to follow it through robustly and make sure the drivers are educated on it as well. The insurers, particularly on medical conditions and things like that now, the insurers are becoming a lot more stringent on looking for issues not to pay out and not to indemnify following collisions and incidents than just leaving it to chance. So hope that helps. Okay. So we'll just finish off now. Quick summary of what we've dealt with as we're pushing for time. Engagement, education, re-education is vital with yourselves as a company and your employees. You need to embed, implement and continuously manage policies robustly, and risks continue to change with medical conditions, with medication, with the work environment. It all changes all the time. Private life is an employer risk, and you need to consider that when you're asking your employees what to do. Drivers need to manage themselves and not just be managed. Drivers need to take responsibility for their actions as much as the employer. And don't assume a driver has told you everything. A recent survey, I think, on the medical conditions alone, I think only 3% of people out there in the country realise that there are over 175 potentially reportable medical conditions out there. So that's just a basic summary. And you need to challenge your employees as well. If something raises your suspicion, don't be afraid to challenge. It's your company's reputation that is on the line at the end of the day. Failure to know is a catastrophe waiting to happen, and have a disaster plan in place. And just by way to finish, as you've seen, I like the videos, just to finish the whole session, if you decide to take nothing else away from the session today, then just have a watch of this. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andrew. We are at the end of the session. I know there are some questions that haven't been answered, but we will look through those and provide some written responses to the end. All that's left to do really is thanks Tony for joining us to ask some of the questions. Thank you very much, Andrew, for agreeing to come in and deliver the session, and thank you all for listening. We hope that you found it informative, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you very much, and goodbye. I'm going to end the meeting now, so you will get kicked out in a few minutes. Okay, thank you.